Okay.
Great. Well, another huge family conversation within our education and current event political type topics. But today we're going to be diving more into postmodernism and critical theory and kind of how these two ideas have evolved. I think as we were kind of talking off screen, we are going to talk more about kind of what they are and the history of them, and then of course this is kind of from what we've talked about, Christian, is this is kind of really the heart of what we've been leading up to. All of our previous um, conversations have been leading up to kind of this big idea, and then there's going to be a lot more that comes after it. But this is kind of that first main topic of postmodernism, critical theory, and how these things have influenced our culture and activism and different things. But yeah, kind of, I guess, take us away. What floor is yours?
Sure. Um, I think what's interesting to me, I mean, we've done this for a couple months now, but I remember talking to Dad for a long time and him being like, there's so much. It's not easy. Actually, I don't know if you can. I mean, I don't think we could sit down and be like, let's unpack postmodernism, what it is, where it came from, what it's doing, the thing it's attacking thing, this idea. I don't think we could sit down and do that in 3 hours. This is a serious amount of work that there are a lot of minor details that are critical to connect
Well,
in
and
order
if
to
I
understand.
could I
Yeah.
cut you off for a sec? I
Yep.
think to your point, I if someone hasn't watched our conversation about meta narratives, they probably need to go back
Yeah.
and do that because I think to your point, postmodernism is a meta narrative in a sense that it's not.
In an ironic sense, yes.
Yes, that it's so different and just I guess unknown to liberalism and how we kind of have lived for and how history's been written for the last thousands of years or hundreds of years maybe, that postmodernism is kind of even difficult to articulate. Like I'm seeing you
Yep.
kind of like, I'm not even really sure where to go with that because it's an entirely kind of separate meta narrative that is important to even understand what those are to begin with. So
Yeah.
sorry to cut you off.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, we've talked about it, geez, plenty now, but if if I find myself sitting in school being like, what is it exactly that I have a problem with in this type of ideology that's being pushed or this kind of idea, narrative, whatever. It's like, well, you can't just go, here's the problem and why I don't like it. You need to back way up and understand what we're living in, how it's structured, and then how this piece is attacking or trying to fit within this entire big thing. So yeah, I think we're saying the same thing differently. Well, not even differently. They go hand in hand. So I think what ultimately we're going to get at is we're going to get to this book. I mean, it's copyrighted. I don't know if I
Yep.
can even say it or if we can talk about it, but I don't know how it works. But this book, Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. It's a great book. Anybody listening should definitely go read it. Um, but what I think we need to do is lay a little bit more groundwork on maybe connecting some of the dots that are really going to get us there. And what I really like about the authors is they take postmodernism. They have kind of coined this term applied postmodernism, but essentially, what I think is this theory that has been evolving for decades, and now we see it kind of rearing several heads of the Hydra in all sorts of different places. But I think before you can really get to that and really start to dissect why that's wrong, and I think you have to understand the history of exactly how we got here, who the scholars, if you want to call them that, the thinkers, the people that are involved in really pushing it, how it got within the United States, what exactly it's trying to do, and how to identify it. So I think there's some groundwork that still has to be done before it's like, hey, let's jump right into fat studies or queer theory or feminism or colonialism or critical race theory, et cetera. Those are all have common what's
Roots.
ancestors.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Roots.
roots. Yeah, roots a good way. Ancestors, roots. In postmodernism that and critical theory that I think is important to talk about. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody doesn't know. I've got this list of things that I've written out that I'm reading on my second screen, but and I know you've got it, but there's a couple things that I think are helpful. If I was teaching a crash course or receiving a crash course on postmodernism, there are some things I'd want to know. I'd want to know kind of what it is or how do you define it. I'd want to know, some definitions that are important that you're going to hear over and over. And I think that really is important because a lot of this stuff is hard to define. It's borderline incoherent. But you'll see some themes that appear consistently. I want to know, the major people that are involved because, and I've listed out 5 that we do see regularly. Kind of a what is it, and maybe what's the goal? What's the purpose of this idea or thing? What is it trying to accomplish? So we can kind of work through this. You're kind of familiar with this stuff now.
Yeah.
So we can, I don't know, we can talk a little bit about it, but I think for me, if I'm sitting in class and we start talking about this new idea, I'm like, okay, well, what is it? Like, define it. Give me something, maybe tangible is the wrong word, but something I can chew on and Google and Chat GPT and be like, what exactly am I dealing with? And I'll give you a terrible answer that I hate it from school is it depends, but it depends on who you ask. And I think before I jump into that, that is really important because when we try to define something like liberalism or I don't know, a political faction within the political realm we deal with, or maybe define what a house is, like there are pretty clear definitions, but we're not going to get one here. And this is part of the, I think maybe circular is the wrong way to look at this, but a little bit of the illogical element of postmodernism is it's hard to define. And if you try to define it, you're falling into what it's trying to attack or prevent. So it becomes a little bit not unfalsifiable, because I don't think that's the right word, but it becomes like if you try to define what we're doing, you're doing the thing you shouldn't be doing. So it's a little bit, I haven't quite figured out exactly the word to put on that, but it's a little bit illogical, I think. So there's a few main players. We're going to deal with Michel Foucault. We're going to deal with Jacques Derrida. We're going to deal with Judith Butler as more of a contemporary. We're going to deal with Jean Francois. His last name's hard. It's like Leotard. I call him Francois. Anyway. I really don't know how to say it.
Yeah,
I'm not going to
yeah.
pretend. And then Jean, this one I always struggle with. Baudrillard, I think it's Baudrillard.
Your guess is good.
Anyway, those aren't, yeah, okay. So it's Baudrillard and Butler are a little bit less. When we actually dig into some of these applied postmodernism, we're going to see Judith Butler a lot. Feminist theory, queer theory. What's the other one? Anyway, those 2 specifically. But the big 3 players, Francois, Foucault, and Derrida. So it really depends. What is postmodernism? I think they would each give you a slightly different definition. So I think Francois would say something like a condition of skepticism towards grand legitimating narratives that claim universal explanatory power, which right off the bat is the irony that you and I have talked about extensively is, well, that sounds like a narrative. So if you're trying to explain everything in a vast swath by titling it or giving it a title, I think you're doing the thing you're advocating against. Foucault is very interesting. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what these guys would say, but I think you find some themes that generally recur with them. But essentially rejecting universal truth, objectivity, any type of like linear progress, and instead favoring an analysis on power knowledge. That's going to be a term that we're going to define here in a second. Structures, discourses, and fragmentary power relations and how they shape human subjectivity and domination. I don't know what that means. So we're going to, well, for people that really like to talk about language, I have a hard time understanding a lot of it. And then Derrida, very popular. But deconstruction, I think, is kind of the big idea with him. We want to disrupt these grand narratives, binary oppositions, and ultimately, really like Western philosophical foundations. I think that that kind of that's not a great way of like explaining what it is, but I think those are some themes that we're going to regularly see, and you've seen as we, have worked through this stuff. Trying to deconstruct the meta narrative, we're trying to legitimize other ways of understanding things. We're trying to get rid of objectivity. We're trying to say that truth doesn't exist, like objective truth doesn't exist, and that if you try to actually attain those things, what's happening is you're playing into this system of oppression that has been oppressing people for forever. And ultimately, we're really going to dig into the culture because they're going to argue that the culture is what shapes their language, and the language is what enables you to understand the knowledge and the circumstance that you're living in. So if that's the case, that means that not everybody's living the same experience. If that's the case, that does lend support to there is no objective truth because it depends on how you, where you live, the language you speak, and how you interpret your situation. So I think that's kind of what it is. Now, there's a small distinction that I think comes up in this discussion a lot, but you see postmodernism and post-structuralism. From what I've gathered, postmodernism is much broader. That applies not only to like academia, but it applies to like the aesthetics, arts, to music, to beauty generally. And and when you start destructing or deconstructing some of those things, you get this like weird realm of like irony and playfulness. And if you're applying irony to beauty, you're finding beauty in things that aren't beautiful, but also trying to have multiple layers of meaning. It's pretty unorthodox. I care much less about the art side. The way that I've heard it described is, postmodernism is ultimately embracing sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I think that if you look at it that broadly, I think that kind of fits well. Whereas post-structuralism, I think, is a little bit more of an academic exercise. It's leaving out a lot of the focus on the aesthetics and more focused on the institutions, the laws, the government, the education, the language that really shape power in that aspect. So to be honest with you, I don't know if that's totally right. But that's what I've gathered. So anyway, I think those two terms do get used interchangeably, but I think there's a minor distinction there. So
Well, and
anyway,
if
have I
I
lost you yet?
no, I do remember this point, or I think I do, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. From what I recall about specifically these three that you've mentioned, Francois, Foucault, and Derrida, is that they're not activists themselves, correct?
Yeah,
They're
that's right.
more,
That's right.
they are theorists who are
They're
saying,
intellectuals.
this is
Yep.
what we perceive, and this is how we are interpreting culture and power and language. But they're not necessarily, and they're more making commentaries on those things. They're not necessarily saying, go out into the streets and riot and do crazy
Yep.
things. They're just saying, no, these are our thoughts. And you had kind of said the point of they're almost playful about these ideas of like, no, these are things that are, let's toy with this idea and see what
Yep.
happens if you change this, what ends up kind of being the discussion around it, where I think later we end up seeing more, not these ideas are taken to a much more extreme sense and they're actually put into practice, which is, we're going to get to. But originally they weren't necessarily saying, hey, we need to do this. It's
No,
more,
they were not activists. That's right.
yeah, okay.
They were, and so this is really, I'm glad you brought this up because I think it naturally flows. The authors of this book, they argue that applied postmodernism is just activism. And maybe that's an oversimplification, but it is turned into radical activism. And what I would like to do is illustrate that it didn't start that way. And so I think that's why it was a nice segue. There's a lot of history between 19 Well, we're going to see that it goes back to like 1928, when you have the Frankfurt Institute, and then we get the postmodernist thinkers that are in Europe in 1958 to 1980s, and then you really start to see this radicalism evolve in the 2010s. So yeah, I think for me, as I've been kind of working through this, it's like what exactly happened between that nearly century that really has led us to where we are now. So I'm glad you brought that up. Sorry, that was kind of a
Oh yeah.
verbose way of going through that. But I like ChatGPT's definition of postmodernism when I used it today. An anti-foundational intellectual movement that denies the existence of universal ahistorical grounds for truth, meaning morality or political legitimacy, and instead treats knowledge and norms as historically contingent, linguistically mediated, and power structured. I think that's right. So
Could we break it down a little bit more? What is it
that's what
actually?
we're going to
Because
do.
yeah, no, okay. So if that's the point, because I think something that's helpful, because I even read that and I go, that's a little bit overwhelming. What I guess continue. If you're going to do that, then I will read
Yeah.
more.
So anti-foundational intellectual movement. So you pointed out, this is kind of playful. I think that yeah, there is an element of that, but it's still radical.
Right.
It's saying, and I think there's room for disagreement on this, but one of the takeaways I've got is it this narrative is asking us to question anything to do in history or anything we understand historically, specifically the Enlightenment and the modern movement, um, and say you need to reconsider the way that you viewed this because of what you speak, where you're from, your individual circumstance, and accept that any type of knowledge that you have concluded or acquired out of this is limited, non objective, or subjective, and influenced by those other factors. So, what that does is it lends credibility to this idea that I can believe what I want to believe, and you believing something else other than me is totally fine. We're never going to be able to accomplish this sense of objective truth or objective history or morality. So we might as well be able to just have freedom to do what we want. And this is why the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I think, really is hits the nail on the head because this is the era of that. So there's a lot here, man. And I think we're just gonna kind of scratch the surface. And the book does a really nice job of really breaking this down.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think this is just the framework I think this is good enough for what we're going to do today, if
Yeah.
that's okay. Okay. So a couple definitions. I'll speed this up.
You're good.
We've talked about meta narratives today. So these stories are frameworks that we live within, liberalism, Christianity, these big ideas, power knowledge. So this is something coined by Foucault. The idea that knowledge is inseparable from power. So if you're claiming to know something, there's power that's associated with that. And where did that power come from and who is it oppressing is something they're going to want you to consider. Deconstruction. So we analyze language, texts, and ideas, hoping to reveal like instability, contradiction, and hidden assumptions. So it's this super level of it's super skepticism. Essentially, don't take anything at face value. You need to be finding these things because they're there. That's a baked in, I think, assumption. Hyperreality, that one, what's the word? A simulation or representation that replaces reality. Where I don't think that's going to come up today, so we'll kind of breeze past that. Formativity, we'll skip that one for now too. Linguistic, I think, general conversation is, well, if we're talking about, I guess, I don't know what the other form of that is, but words, grammar, signs, and symbols, but it's not just that here. This is going to specifically address the idea that language is not neutral and that it's loaded up with all sorts of other things. We've talked about this. I won't belabor the point, but meaning is constructed through language. Your language limits what you can understand. And so maybe we need to be reconsidering that our language is limiting, everything we could possibly know. So how could we ever understand or truly prove that we have objective truth?
Yeah.
It's complex stuff, but so I'm kind of blitzing it. This one is important. Normative. So normative is different than the antonym would be something like empirical, or I wrote another one down. Descriptive. Normative is prescribing how things ought to be. This is a very normative narrative that we're going to be dealing with. Whereas empiricism is observing and recording. Descriptive is, as you know, describing what you see. So this is something to consider. These are people that are telling you what you ought to be doing, not trying to describe what they see and how they see it. Something to just kind of keep in the back of your mind. So we've talked about, what it is. I'm going to skip that next part. The goal. I don't know. And at risk of oversimplifying, I wrote down what I kind of think is the goal after, doing some research and talking with the infamous Chat GPT.
The all-knowing.
Say it again.
The all-knowing.
The all-knowing, that's right. Till you push back on it. What I've gathered is this is not a narrative that's just trying to compete and replace truth with truth. This isn't, liberalism it's not trying to replace liberalism because it thinks that not only is liberalism wrong, but it has the answer. It's not trying to do that. It's just trying to deconstruct everything. It's trying to tear everything down. It's trying to tear your language down. It's trying to tear power down, knowledge down, the institutions down because they have all the power and the knowledge, or they've been created by people that had the power and the knowledge. It's trying to uncover hidden dynamics that are within people. A lot of this, if you read this, you're going to be like, this is kind of nonsensical. I think I agree with that sentiment. I think that, what I find myself, and I have to be careful of, is it's like, well, this is still something I need to seriously engage with. I don't want to because I don't think it's worth seriously engaging with, but there are people that do think this is legitimate. So I think to be able to break it down and discuss it is important. So I'm just going to get to the point now, unless you have something else you want to talk about.
Please get to the point.
What is the history? What is it that connected us from Derrida and Francois Lyotard and Foucault that gets us to Judith Butler and that gets us to critical race theory, that gets us to queer theory, that gets us to fat studies, that gets us to all of this stuff. Like I can't imagine that 70 years ago this would even be on people's minds.
Right.
So there's another piece to this that I think is important. And, I first got tuned into this because, Dad and I were talking about it. And I started reading and was like, holy smokes. Like the more it's like an onion, the more I peel, the more there is. So the Frankfurt Institute, a German institute that was affiliated with one of the universities in Frankfurt. And ultimately, I think what happened is, let me give you more of the history. 1920s. Okay, we're back in Germany. This is a long time ago, and what was going on. The 1920s in Germany. So, it emerged, from what I've gathered, after the Marxism and the Western Revolution. The proletariat's supposed to rise up. It didn't happen. And so I think a lot of the theorists are going, why? They want to understand it. And I don't think that's exactly like the reason this was started from what I've read. Maybe that is the case, but not from what I've gathered. I could be wrong. But they're trying to explain this. And essentially it was Marxist. It's Marxist focused, trying to understand. They were sold that this was going to happen. People couldn't believe, at least the theorists couldn't believe this wasn't going to happen. So they start to, dig in a little bit deeper and try to find explanations. So 1930, this is the first big point. Horkheimer becomes director and changes the focus from strictly Marxism to a broader approach. And this is this divergence, and Horkheimer is a very important name. We're going to talk about three really important names. on this list, but we broaden the scope. And I think that what happened is you start to see people go, people aren't solely economic driven. There's more to it than dollars and cents, the wages. So he brings on some other people, brings on Theodore Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Eric Fromm. So Adorno, Marcuse, Fromm, Horkheimer, those are critical names. We're going to talk about them a little bit more in a bit too. But they start expanding this. We move from, specifically just, I mean, if you were moving on from economics, trying to explain people, I mean, I think some of the things you have to understand, psychology, I think that's important, culture, morality. I think there are other pieces that play an important role, like the media, how things influence other people. And so I think that if I were to group all of this together, they start to focus more on the culture stuff that rather than, going to your job, but the stuff that I think really makes people tick, how they're interacting with one another, more the sociological aspect than just the economic aspect. So, sorry,
No,
mouthful.
you're good.
Okay, I'll keep going. The 30s, things start to shift because of, the rise of Hitler.
Yeah.
So the Institute leaves, and this is important because this has been focused in Germany, right? Like it's leaking out into the rest of the world, but it hasn't been heavily.
And just to be clear, this is a legitimate group of people organized in a school of thought
Yeah, this isn't a cult or anything. No,
right.
this is a university.
Okay.
It's been endorsing this.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important because even when I was first reading, I was like the German Institute. Okay, I guess that's got to be some sort of group of people. So yeah, it's an actual school of people attending and
Yes.
learning about these ideas.
These are well, I that's a
Or
good question. Actually, I don't know. These are intellectuals that are doing research and they're writing. So they're maybe I would, if I were to flip, I bet yeah, I would suspect that they probably had students that they were teaching. Um, yeah, I suspect that was probably the case, but I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't know, but those guys did end up teaching in the United States, which is where I'm going to end up going. Well, it's where I'm going with this right now.
yeah.
Um, so they end up leaving Germany. I don't know exactly what happened, what the opinion was with the regime at that time. But they end up leaving. They end up in like Geneva, they end up in Paris, and they end up in New York City. Convenient. Specifically, it started with affiliations with Columbia, from what I've read. And then eventually these guys end up teaching at universities all over the country. So I'll get to that. But 37, this is when some legitimacy, I think, starts to really come internationally from these guys. They're working on critical theory. Okay, that's going to be something we talk about, and Pluckrose and James do talk about that. It's just important to know that theory is different from postmodernism, and we're not going to spend too much time on theory, but the relationship is interesting. They're distinct. So Horkheimer publishes this essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, essentially arguing that society is structured by dominating forces, or people are oppressed, they're dominated everywhere. Culture and ideology reinforces domination. Enlightenment rationality can become instrumental to that oppression. So you're starting to maybe see some themes that are overlapping here a little bit. And that theory is designed to emancipate and not like liberate you from yourself, but like eliminate, what's what I'm looking for? Liberate you from everything. From ideas, from people, from power structures, from language. It's designed to make you free. And we'll come back to that. But in Marxism, it was a little bit different. Marxism was focusing, solely on the economics. So I think that the reason that I point out that distinction is because I said that they broadened the scope. And I think that this essay is proof that the focus shifted a little bit. So again, we're talking about freeing people from something. Well, I'm curious what they need to be freed from. Domination is the answer. Another essay comes out in 1944, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, reinforcing and furthering this idea that Enlightenment rationality has been turned into an oppressive tool or a tool for oppression. So, talked about that. After World War II, the Institute comes back to Germany. So I think there's professors have left, professors, the intellectuals have left, they've come back, they've regrouped, and then we start to see them expand again. But some of them were teaching, I mean, kind of throughout the whole time. So let me, yeah, so Horkheimer at Columbia in the 30s and 40s, Chicago, University of Chicago in the 50s, Adorno, Princeton and Berkeley in the 30s and 40s, returned to Germany, taught there. This was kind of the regrouping in the 50s. Marcuse, Columbia, Harvard, Brandeis University, Cal, UCSD, which is San Diego, mostly in the 60s. So you see them, there's this influence that's going on before postmodernism, right? Because it's starting to really get popular, in the 60s and then the 70s, and then all the, into the 80s too. A little bit different though. But if you look at some of this overlap, it's interesting. So you have Derrida that's teaching at Yale in the 60s, at UC Irvine in the 70s and the 80s, John Hopkins, NYU, and Cornell as well. Foucault, Buffalo in the 70s, Berkeley in the 80s, spent some time at Cornell. Francois, Hal, UC Irvine, Emory in Georgia, other institutions, mostly in the 80s and the early 90s. So what we see going on is you have theory that's over here that's deconstructive, you have postmodernism that's coming in that's deconstructive, and you see a heavy overlap at some of these, tier one institutions in the United States. So I think my quick assumption was, well, they must have just been teaching and, students that have overlapping interests. And I don't know if that's true, but you have some of these popular theorists, geez, the names are like slipping right past me right now, but you have your CRT, your critical race theory advocates now. You have Judith Butler. There's a number of them. We're going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Said, that's post-colonialism. These people are educating at these institutions, doing post-grad work, and they're reading this literature from both. And so what I think happens is, or what I think happened was the institutions really were the way that these got connected. And you might be like, well, duh. Okay. But I think that, if you take, general observations now of which institutions tend to lead the fight or lead the charge on a lot of this stuff, a lot of these universities are in that list. So I'll start to wrap it up a little bit, but I think that was fascinating to me because we had them coming from all over the world. And I'm like, how do we actually get this influence? Well, it's that they were teaching here, they're publishing, and you have people that are, grabbing on and applying it to all sorts of things. So when you have this deconstructive kind of approach, well, geez, anybody that doesn't like the way that the power dynamic is currently structured latches onto these ideas and says, why don't we change it? Why don't we reject the way we've been doing it forever? At least for the last, couple hundred years since the Enlightenment. Why don't we start to break things down and build them up how we like it? Because, go ahead.
No, yeah, you mentioned a few others, Crenshaw, Bell, some other ones that
That's what I
were.
was thinking of. Yeah,
Um,
Bell.
it's interesting. In this could be true, it could not be true. I don't know. Just as you've been talking, it's like I wonder if part of why maybe some of these original theorists weren't, I guess, as serious activists is because partly I think Europe at the time wasn't really the place for activism. It was kind of a you need to be part of the regime, as you said, or you're gonna get your
Well, look at what happened the 100 years leading up to that, or the hundreds of years. Look at what happened to the revolutions.
right.
I mean, Europe was a dumpster fire. People are being slaughtered. I mean, you have all sorts of things people are fighting about. So yeah, I think that's right. Also, this isn't shocking to you, but there's not as much freedom in Europe as there is in the United
Yeah.
States, especially maybe I'll go out on a limb here and say intellectual freedom, freedom of idea and expression, affiliation. And so I think that, yeah, I think you're exactly right that this was a breeding ground, especially at these what are predominantly exceptionally liberal institutions that are trying to push the boundaries and undermine, a lot of these what they call power structures. Um, yeah,
Well,
I think that's exactly right.
and if I may, I think some of, when they came to the States, a lot of these big universities in their original intent was not necessarily to challenge, I think, as we say, kind of the cultural, the power structures, the language, all of that, but they were, I mean, advancing technology and medicine and all of these things at a very rapid rate. I mean, geez, Columbia, Berkeley, Cal,
Yeah.
NYU, all of these universities, I mean, they are world renowned for their
Yep.
for producing radical change in every industry. And so I don't think that it's interesting, maybe that's a point, is that for certain theorists to then pose these ideas that might other places have seemed, I mean, we're not talking, you know, um, University of Nebraska. We're not talking like Brigham Young
Yeah.
University down the road, right? Had these guys maybe gone to other places, it might have been like, you guys are a little bit off your rocker. I don't know that that's what we're going to do. But they were in the perfect, as you said, breeding ground for some of these. You want to challenge ideas, go to these places because they're
Yep.
world renowned for changing the world,
Doing that.
right? In
Yep.
most of the time in the history of those universities, in very positive, good ways. It just so happens that, you add a little bit of, you know, a bad, unique thing, and that can also blow up into something, I guess, equally as harmful as the good that they've done too, you know?
Yeah. Yep. It is. Yep. Yep. It couldn't have gone better for them. They found exactly where they needed to be. So I think I mean, I'll wrap it up. I found it interesting, the big gap, the big jump between we go from Foucault, Judith Butler, and I don't hear them talking the same language a little bit. I see some of the same elements, or I can trace it, but I was like, how did we get here? And the Frankfurt Institute was a big part of it because it was out. I mean, it was in the United States. So were the people pushing postmodernism, but they end up. It's this perfect combination of attacking power, of delegitimizing the way things are, undermining language, and I mean, deconstructing just reality. So I think it made for the perfect storm for that to really take root. And I think it's attractive to some people. I mean, I'm not attracted to it, so I'm speculating, but I think that when you find yourself as part of the margin rather than the majority,
Yeah.
I think you're interested in flipping the script because you feel like you're being oppressed or dominated or you lack power. So I see why that's appealing. If you don't fit within what's been prescribed as the grouping, then maybe you want to change the grouping. So, or reject the grouping.
Yeah.
It's been wrong the whole time. So I that's where we are. So now we have to really dig into what's the connection between postmodernism and applied postmodernism that they've coined. And then we'll go in specifically, here's where we're seeing it maybe right now, because that book's a few years old now. And I think they nailed it on every category. And so we'll kind of dive through and maybe dissect that.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait. I think it's a great place to end off. And until next week,
Okay. See ya.
see ya.